China crushes Europe and the US in the EV race. A global power shift unfolds. China's rise in the electric vehicle, EV industry is nothing short of a revolution, and it's sending shockwaves across the globe. The United States and Europe, long considered the powerhouses of the automotive world, are now scrambling to keep up. What was once an industry dominated by Western giants like Ford, General Motors, and Volkswagen is now being reshaped by Chinese companies that are moving at an unprecedented pace. The numbers tell a staggering story. China accounted for more than 60% of global EV sales in 2023, and its influence in the market is only growing. But how did this happen? How did China, which was once known for cheap knockoff cars, become the leader in the most important automotive revolution of the 21st century? To understand this shift, we need to go back to the early 2000s when China was still playing catch-up in the global car market. At the time, the country relied heavily on foreign automakers to meet demand, and domestic brands were struggling to gain recognition. However, behind the scenes, the Chinese government was already laying the groundwork for what would become one of the most aggressive industrial transformations in history. Unlike Western countries, where the auto industry was resistant to change, China saw an opportunity to leapfrog traditional gas-powered vehicles and go straight into electric mobility. It was a high-risk, high-reward strategy that would take decades to pay off. But when it did, the impact would be nothing short of seismic. The government began rolling out massive subsidies to support the EV industry. Billions of dollars were poured into research and development, charging infrastructure, and battery technology. Unlike the US, where EV adoption was largely left to market forces, China took a direct approach, ensuring that domestic companies had every possible advantage. Local governments gave preferential treatment to homegrown EV manufacturers, offering tax breaks, cheap land for factories, and even direct cash incentives for consumers who purchased electric cars. The result? A flourishing ecosystem where companies like BYD, NIO, and XPeng could thrive, unburdened by the legacy costs and bureaucratic red tape that slowed down Western automakers. One of the most crucial factors in China's success was its dominance over the EV supply chain. The production of electric vehicles relies on critical minerals like lithium, cobalt, and nickel, resources that are not always easy to obtain. While the US and Europe were slow to realize the importance of securing these materials, China moved quickly. It invested heavily in lithium mines in South America and Africa, locking in long-term supply contracts and gaining control over the raw materials that power the global EV industry. Today, China processes around 70% of the world's lithium, meaning that even American and European car manufacturers are forced to rely on Chinese companies for their batteries. The scale of China's EV manufacturing is something the world has never seen before. In the city of Shenzhen alone, there are now over 16,000 electric buses on the streets, making it the first city in the world to have a fully electrified public transport system. In the commercial vehicle sector, China is outpacing its competitors at an alarming rate, producing more electric trucks and delivery vans than any other country. Even in the consumer market, China's influence is undeniable. Companies like BYD are now outselling Tesla in some markets, and Chinese-made EVs are flooding into Europe, shaking up an industry that has long been dominated by German and French automakers. But perhaps the most shocking part of this story is how quickly China's rise has forced the rest of the world to change course. In Europe, where legacy automakers like Volkswagen and BMW have built their reputations on engineering excellence, the realization that China is leading the EV race has been a wake-up call. European regulators are now scrambling to introduce policies that can help domestic manufacturers compete, but many fear it may be too little, too late. In the US, the situation is even more dire. While companies like Tesla have kept America relevant in the EV space, the country's broader auto industry is struggling to adapt. Ford and General Motors have faced production delays, supply chain issues, and a lack of government support compared to what China has provided its automakers. As we stand on the brink of a new era in transportation, one thing is clear: the world's Automotive power balance has shifted, and China is now firmly in the driver's seat. But this story is far from over, because what happens next could reshape global economies, rewrite trade relationships, and determine who controls the future of mobility. Will Europe and the US find a way to catch up? Or has China already won the EV race? The answer could change everything. China's dominance in the EV race isn't just about production numbers. It's about an entire ecosystem designed for one goal: global supremacy in the future of mobility. While the US and Europe debate policy changes, China has already executed a decades-long strategy, pulling ahead in every key aspect of the electric vehicle revolution, from raw materials to battery technology, from consumer adoption to global exports. The world's second-largest economy is now the undisputed leader in an industry that will define the next century. And as Western automakers scramble to respond, the real question isn't whether China has won the EV race. It's whether anyone else can even compete. At the heart of China's EV strategy is its total control over the supply chain. It's one thing to manufacture electric cars, but it's another to dominate the essential components that make them run. Take lithium-ion batteries, for example. The single most expensive part of any EV, batteries determine everything from price to driving range to charging speed. While the West was busy trying to transition from gas-powered vehicles, China quietly built an empire of battery production that now supplies the entire world. Today, over 75% of all lithium-ion batteries are made in China, with companies like KTL and BYD leading the charge. Tesla, Ford, Volkswagen, all of them rely on Chinese battery manufacturers to keep their EVs on the road. And it's not just battery production, it's also the raw materials. Lithium, cobalt, nickel. These are the elements that power the EV revolution, and China has spent years securing access to them. While the US and Europe hesitated to invest in mining, China struck deals across the world, buying up mines in Africa, South America, and Australia. In some cases, Chinese companies didn't just invest in mining operations, they bought them outright. Today, over 60% of the world's lithium refining takes place in China, giving it a stranglehold on the one resource no EV manufacturer can live without. While the rest of the world is still figuring out how to scale up production, China is already mass-producing affordable electric vehicles at an unprecedented rate. One of the biggest criticisms of EVs in the West has been their high price, which makes adoption slower among middle-class consumers. But in China, brands like BYD, NIO, and XPeng have cracked the code, producing high-quality electric cars that sell for as little as $10,000. The Wuling Hongguang Mini EV, for example, became one of the best-selling EVs in the world, not because of luxury features or advanced technology, but because it was cheap, reliable, and accessible to the average consumer. This focus on affordability has allowed China to rapidly electrify its domestic market, while also preparing to flood international markets with low-cost EVs that Western automakers can't compete with. And China isn't just winning at home. It's expanding aggressively overseas. In Europe, Chinese EV exports have skyrocketed, with brands like BYD now outselling some traditional European carmakers in their own backyard. Germany, France, and the UK have seen a surge in Chinese EV imports, raising concerns about the future of their domestic auto industries. The European Union is now scrambling to impose tariffs on Chinese-made EVs, fearing that local automakers will be wiped out by the flood of cheaper, high-tech vehicles from the East. But even if the EU enacts trade barriers, it may already be too late. European consumers are embracing Chinese EVs, drawn in by their lower prices, longer range, and cutting-edge features. In the US, the situation is even more precarious. While Tesla has helped keep America in the EV conversation, the broader US auto industry is falling behind. Ford and General Motors have struggled with production issues, high costs, and supply chain disruptions that have slowed their EV rollout. Meanwhile, Chinese companies are quietly laying the groundwork to enter the American market. BYD, for example, is already the world's largest EV manufacturer by volume, and it has plans to expand sales beyond China and Europe. While trade restrictions currently prevent Chinese automakers from selling directly in the US, that could change quickly if they find ways to set up local production or partner with existing American companies. And then there's infrastructure. One of the biggest challenges for EV adoption is charging networks. Without enough fast charging stations, consumers hesitate to switch from gasoline to electric. Here again, China is light years ahead. The country has built the world's most extensive EV charging network, with over 6.5 million charging points nationwide. Compare that to the US, where public charging infrastructure is still sparse, and it's clear why China's EV market is moving at a much faster pace. In cities like Shenzhen and Shanghai, charging an EV is as easy as pulling into a parking lot, while in many parts of the US and Europe, finding a fast charger can still be a frustrating challenge. The sheer scale of China's EV dominance is staggering. But what makes this story even more shocking is how quickly it has unfolded. Just 15 years ago, China's auto industry was still playing catch-up with the West, producing cheap, low-quality knockoffs of foreign cars. Today, it's not only leading the EV revolution, but setting the standard for what the future of transportation will look like. And while the US and Europe are trying to catch up, the reality is that China's head start may be too big to overcome. So where does this leave the West? Can traditional automakers like Ford, Volkswagen, and BMW find a way to compete? Or are they doomed to become relics of a gas-powered past? Governments in the US and Europe are scrambling to respond, introducing new policies and incentives to boost domestic EV production. But with China already miles ahead, the question remains, is it too late? The answer to that question could determine not just the future of the auto industry, but the balance of global economic power itself. As China's grip on the EV market tightens, the world stands at a crossroads. The US and Europe are now realizing that they are not just competing in an industry shift. They are fighting to maintain their place in the global economy. The consequences of falling behind in the EV race go far beyond the auto sector. This is about energy independence, geopolitical leverage, and control over the industries that will power the future. If China continues on its current trajectory, it won't just dominate electric vehicles. It will dictate the pace of technological innovation, supply chains, and trade policies worldwide. And that is a reality Western nations are only beginning to grasp. For decades, the United States and Europe have used the power of their automotive industries to shape global markets. The rise of Ford, General Motors, Volkswagen, and BMW created millions of jobs, fueled entire economies, and gave the West an undeniable strategic advantage. But China is now rewriting that playbook. Through a combination of state-backed investment, long-term resource control, and rapid innovation, it has positioned itself as the unchallenged leader in the most important automotive revolution in history. And unlike Western companies, which must answer to shareholders and navigate political uncertainty, Chinese automakers benefit from a government willing to do whatever it takes to secure dominance. The question now is, can the West fight back? In the US, the Biden administration has made EVs a central part of its economic and environmental policies, offering billions of dollars in incentives for domestic manufacturing and clean energy production. The Inflation Reduction Act includes provisions to encourage American-made EVs, reducing reliance on Chinese imports. But the reality is that US automakers are still struggling to scale up production, and the American charging network remains underdeveloped. Meanwhile, Tesla, the country's most successful EV manufacturer, is still heavily dependent on Chinese-made batteries, highlighting just how deeply China's influence extends. Europe, on the other hand, is facing an even more immediate crisis. The flood of Chinese EVs into European markets is already causing alarm, with officials considering tariffs and trade barriers to protect local manufacturers. But protectionist policies alone won't be enough. European automakers must find a way to match China's speed, efficiency, and affordability. Volkswagen, once the undisputed leader in global auto sales, has been forced to rethink its entire EV strategy, accelerating its transition or risk losing ground permanently. Even legacy giants like BMW and Mercedes-Benz are acknowledging that the days of complete Western dominance are over. Meanwhile, China is pushing forward with even more ambitious plans. The country's new energy vehicle policy isn't just about cars. It's about reshaping the entire transportation sector. Electric buses, trucks, and even high-speed rail networks are being electrified at an astonishing pace. Cities like Shenzhen have already eliminated gas-powered taxis and buses entirely, creating a glimpse of what an all-electric future could look like. And as Chinese companies expand their reach into new markets, including Southeast Asia, Latin America, and Africa, their influence is growing well beyond their borders. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. While China is winning the EV race today, there are signs that cracks may be forming in its strategy. For one, the sheer scale of its EV production has led to concerns about overcapacity. Factories are churning out millions of vehicles, but as domestic competition heats up, some companies may struggle to remain profitable. Additionally, China's reliance on state subsidies raises the question of long-term sustainability. If the government ever pulls back its financial support, could some of these companies survive on their own? And then there's the growing pushback from the West. The US and Europe may have been slow to react, but they are now waking up to the reality that they must act fast. The next few years will determine whether Western automakers can innovate quickly enough to remain competitive or whether China's dominance becomes irreversible. If the US and Europe fail to regain momentum, they could become permanently dependent on Chinese technology, batteries, and supply chains, something that would have major economic and national security implications. So, is it too late for the West to catch up? That depends on what happens next. If American and European automakers can find a way to ramp up production, secure their own supply chains, and build better charging infrastructure, they may still have a chance. But if China continues at its current pace, the world may soon reach a tipping point. One where the future of transportation is no longer shaped by Detroit or Stuttgart, but by Shenzhen and Shanghai. One thing is certain: the global power shift is already happening. The only question now is whether the US and Europe can stop it, or if they'll be left in the dust, watching as China drives the world into the electric age.